Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 2. The Prussian State, October 28, 1851. The political movement of the middle class or bourgeoisie in Germany may be dated from 1840. It had been preceded by symptoms showing that the moneyed and industrial class of that country was ripening into a state which would no longer allow it to continue apathetic and passive under the pressure of a half-feudal, half-bureaucratic monarchism. The smaller princes of Germany, partly to ensure to themselves a greater independence against the supremacy of Austria and Prussia, or against the influence of the nobility of their own states, partly in order to consolidate into a whole the disconnected provinces united under their rule by the Congress of Vienna, one after the other granted constitutions of a more or less liberal character. They could do so without any danger to themselves, for if the Diet of the Confederation, this mere puppet of Austria and Prussia, was to encroach upon their independence as sovereigns, they knew that in resisting its dictates they would be backed by public opinion in the chambers, and if, on the contrary, these chambers grew too strong, they could readily command the power of the Diet to break down all opposition. The Bavarian, Württemberg, Baden, or Hanoverian constitutional institutions could not, under such circumstances, give rise to any serious struggle for political power, and, therefore, the great bulk of the German middle class kept very generally aloof from the petty squabbles raised in the legislatures of the small states, well knowing that without a fundamental change in the policy and constitution of the two great powers of Germany, no secondary efforts and victories would be of any avail. But at the same time, a race of liberal lawyers, professional oppositionists, sprung up in these small assemblies. The Rattachs, the Welkers, the Romers, the Jordans, the Stuves, the Eisenmans, those great popular men who, after a more or less noisy, but always unsuccessful, opposition of 20 years, were carried to the summit of power by the revolutionary springtide of 1848, and who, after having there shown their utter impotency and insignificance, were hurled down again in a moment. These first specimen upon German soil of the traitor in politics and opposition, by their speeches and writings made familiar to the German ear the language of constitutionalism, and by their very existence foreboded the approach of a time when the middle class would seize upon and restore to their proper meaning political phrases, which these talkative attorneys and professors were in the habit of using without knowing much about the sense originally attached to them. German literature, too, labored under the influence of the political excitement into which all Europe had been thrown by the events of 1830. A crude constitutionalism, or a still cruder republicanism, were preached by almost all writers of the time. It became more and more the habit, particularly of the inferior sorts of literati, to make up for the wants of cleverness in their productions by political allusions which were sure to attract attention. Poetry, novels, reviews, the drama, every literal production teemed with what was called tendency, that is, with more or less timid exhibitions of an anti-governmental spirit. In order to complete the confusion of ideas reigning after 1830 in Germany, with these elements of political opposition there were mixed up ill-digested university recollections of German philosophy and misunderstood gleanings from French socialism, particularly Saint-Simonism, and the clique of writers who expatiated upon this heterogeneous conglomerate of ideas presumptuously call themselves Young Germany or the Modern School. They have since repented their youthful sins, but not improved their style of writing. Lastly, German philosophy, that most complicated, but at the same time most sure thermometer of the development of the German mind, had declared for the middle class, when Hegel in his philosophy of law pronounced constitutional monarchy to be the final and most perfect form of government. In other words, he proclaimed the approaching advent of the middle classes of the country to political power. His school, after his death, did not stop here. While the more advanced section of his followers, on the one hand, subjected every religious belief to the ordeal of a rigorous criticism and shook to its foundation the ancient fabric of Christianity, they, at the same time, brought forward bolder political principles than hitherto it had been the fate of German ears to hear expounded, and attempted to restore to glory the memory of the heroes of the First French Revolution. The abstruse philosophical language in which those ideas were clothed, if it obscured the mind of both the writer and the reader, equally blinded the eyes of the censor, and thus it was that the young Hegelian writers enjoyed a liberty of the press unknown in every other branch of literature. Thus it was evident that public opinion was undergoing a great change in Germany. By degrees, the vast majority of those classes whose educational position in life enabled them, under an absolute monarchy, to gain some political information, and to form anything like an independent political opinion, united into one mighty phalanx of opposition against the existing system. And in passing judgment upon the slowness of political development in Germany, no one ought to omit taking into account the difficulty of obtaining correct information upon any subject in a country where all sources of information were under the control of the government, where from the ragged school and the Sunday school to the newspaper and university nothing was said, taught, printed, or published but what had previously obtained its approbation. Look at Vienna, for instance. The people of Vienna, its industry and manufactures, second to none perhaps in Germany, in spirit, courage, and revolutionary energy proving themselves far superior to all, were yet more ignorant as to their real interests, and committed more blunders during the revolution than any others, and this was due in a very great measure to the almost absolute ignorance with regard to the very commonest political subjects in which Metternich's government had succeeded in keeping them. It needs no further explanation why, under such a system, political information was an almost exclusive monopoly of such classes of society as could afford to pay for its being smuggled into the country, and more particularly of those whose interests were most seriously attacked by the existing state of things, namely, the manufacturing and commercial classes. They, therefore, were the first to unite in a mass against the continuance of a more or less disguised absolutism, and from their passing into the ranks of the opposition must be dated the beginning of the real revolutionary movement in Germany. The oppositional pronunciamiento of the German bourgeoisie may be dated from 1840, from the death of the late King of Prussia, the last surviving founder of the Holy Alliance of 1815. The new king was known to be no supporter of the predominantly bureaucratic and military monarchy of his father. What the French middle class had expected from the advent of Louis XVI, the German bourgeoisie hoped, in some measure, from Frederick William IV of Prussia. It was agreed upon all hands that the old system was exploded, worn out, and must be given up, and what had been borne in silence under the old king now was loudly proclaimed to be intolerable. But if Louis XVI, Louis le Désiré, had been a plain, unpretending simpleton, half conscious of his own nullity, without any fixed opinions, ruled principally by the habits contracted during his education, Frederick William le Désiré was something quite different. While he certainly surpassed his French original in weakness of character, he was neither without pretensions nor without opinions. He had made himself acquainted, in an amateur sort of way, with the rudiments of most sciences, and thought himself, therefore, learned enough to consider final his judgment upon every subject. He made sure he was a first-rate orator, and there was certainly no commercial traveler in Berlin who could beat him either in prolixity of pretended wit or in fluency of elocution. He hated and despised the bureaucratic element of the Prussian monarchy, but only because all his sympathies were with the feudal element. Himself one of the founders of, and chief contributors to, the Berlin political weekly paper, the so-called historical school, a school living upon the ideas of Bonald, Lemaitre, and other writers of the first generation of French legitimists, he aimed at a restoration, as complete as possible, of the predominant social position of the nobility. The king, first nobleman of his realm, surrounded in the first instance by a splendid court of mighty vassals, princes, dukes, and counts. In the second instance, by numerous and wealthy lower nobility, ruling according to his discretion over his loyal burgesses and peasants, and thus being himself the chief of a complete hierarchy of social ranks or castes, each of which was to enjoy its particular privileges, and to be separated from the others by the almost insurmountable barrier of birth, or of a fixed, inalterable social position. The whole of these castes, or estates of the realm, balancing each other at the same time so nicely in power and influence that a complete independence of action should remain with the king. Such was the beau ideal which Frederick William IV undertook to realize, and which he is again trying to realize at the present moment. It took some time before the Prussian bourgeoisie, not very well versed in theoretical questions, found out the real purport of their king's tendency. But what they very soon found out was the fact that he was bent upon things quite the reverse of what they wanted. Hardly did the new king find his gift of the gab unfettered by his father's death than he set about proclaiming his intentions in speeches without number, and every speech, every act of his, went far to estrange him from the sympathies of the middle class. He would not have cared much for that, if it had not been for some stern and startling realities which interrupted his poetic dreams. Alas, that romanticism is not very quick at accounts, and that feudalism, ever since Don Quixote, reckons without its host. Frederick William IV partook too much of that contempt of ready cash which ever has been the noblest inheritance of the sons of the Crusaders. He found at his succession a costly, although parsimoniously arranged system of government, and a moderately filled state treasury. In 2 years, every trace of a surplus was spent in court festivals, royal progresses, largesses, subventions to needy, seedy, and greedy noblemen, etc., and the regular taxes were no longer sufficient for the exigencies of either court or government. And thus His Majesty found himself very soon placed between a glaring deficit on one side and the law of 1820 on the other, by which any new loan or any increase of the then existing taxation was made illegal without the assent of the future representation of the people. This representation did not exist. The new king was less inclined than even his father to create it, and if he had been, he knew that public opinion had wonderfully changed since his accession. Indeed, the middle classes, who had partly expected that the new king would at once grant a constitution, proclaim the liberty of the press, trial by jury, etc., etc., in short, himself take the lead of that peaceful revolution which they wanted in order to obtain political supremacy, the middle classes had found out their error and had turned ferociously against the king. In the Rhine provinces, and more or less generally all over Prussia, they were so exasperated that they, being short themselves of men able to represent them in the press, went to the length of an alliance with the extreme philosophical party of which we have spoken above. The fruit of this alliance was the Rhenish Gazette of Cologne, a paper which was suppressed after 15 months' existence, but from which must be dated the existence of the newspaper press in Germany. This was in 1842. The poor king, whose commercial difficulties were the keenest satire upon his medieval propensities, very soon found out that he could not continue to reign without making some slight concession to the popular outcry for that representation of the people, which, as the last remnant of the long-forgotten promises of 1813 and 1815, had been embodied in the law of 1820. He found the least objectionable mode of satisfying this untoward law in calling together the standing committees of the Provincial Diets. The Provincial Diets had been instituted in 1823. They consisted for every one of the 8 provinces of the kingdom. 1. Of the higher nobility, the formerly sovereign families of the German Empire, the heads of which were members of the Diet by birthright. 2. Of the representatives of the knights, or lower nobility. 3. of representatives of towns, 4 of deputies of the peasantry or small farming class. The whole was arranged in such a manner that in every province the 2 sections of the nobility always had a majority of the Diet. Every one of these 8 provincial diets elected a committee, and these 8 committees were now called to Berlin in order to form a representative assembly for the purpose of voting the much-desired loan. It was stated that the treasury was full, and that the loan was required, not for current wants, but for the construction of a state railway. But the united committees gave the king a flat refusal, declaring themselves incompetent to act as the representatives of the people, and called upon His Majesty to fulfill the promise of a representative constitution which his father had given when he wanted the aid of the people against Napoleon. The sitting of the united committees proved that the spirit of opposition was no longer confined to the bourgeoisie. A part of the peasantry had joined them, and many nobles, being themselves large farmers on their own properties and dealers in corn, wool, spirits, and flax, requiring the same guarantees against absolutism, bureaucracy, and feudal restoration, had equally pronounced against the government and for a representative constitution. The king's plan had signally failed. He had got no money and had increased the power of the opposition. The subsequent sitting of the Provincial Diets themselves was still more unfortunate for the king. All of them asked for reforms, for the fulfillment of the promises of 1813 and 1815, for a constitution and a free press. The resolutions to this effect of some of them were rather disrespectfully worded, and the ill-humored replies of the exasperated king made the evil still greater. In the meantime, the financial difficulties of the government went on increasing. For a time, abatements were made upon the moneys appropriated for the different public services. Fraudulent transactions with the Seehandlung, a commercial establishment speculating and trading for account and risk of the state, and long since acting as its money broker, had sufficed to keep up appearances. Increased issues of state paper money had funded some resources, and the secret, upon the whole, had been pretty well kept. But all these contrivances were soon exhausted. There was another plan tried, the establishment of a bank, the capital of which was to be furnished partly by the state and partly by private shareholders, the chief direction to belong to the state, in such a manner as to enable the government to draw upon the funds of this bank to a large amount, and thus to repeat the same fraudulent transactions that would no longer do with the Seehandlung. But as a matter of course, there were no capitalists to be found who would hand over their money upon such conditions. The statutes of the bank had to be altered, and the property of the shareholders guaranteed from the encroachments of the treasury before any shares were subscribed to. Thus, this plan having failed, there remained nothing to try but a loan, if capitalists could be found who would lend their cash without requiring the permission and guarantee of that mysterious future representation of the people. Rothschild was applied to, and he declared that if the loan was to be guaranteed by this representation of the people, he would undertake the thing at a moment's notice. If not, he could not have anything to do with the transaction. Thus every hope of obtaining money had vanished, and there was no possibility of escaping the fatal representation of the people. Rothschild's refusal was known in autumn 1846, and in February of the next year, the king called together all the 8 provincial diets to Berlin, forming them into one united diet. This diet was to do the work required, in case of need, by the law of 1820. It was to vote loans and increase taxes, but beyond that it was to have no rights. Its voice upon general legislation was to be merely consultative. It was to assemble, not at fixed periods, but whenever it pleased the king. It was to discuss nothing but what the government pleased to lay before it. Of course, the members were very little satisfied with the part they were expected to perform. They repeated the wishes they had announced when they met in the provincial assemblies. The relations between them and the government soon became acrimonious, and when the loan, which was again stated to be required for railway constructions, was demanded from them, they again refused to grant it. This vote very soon brought their sitting to a close. The king, more and more exasperated, dismissed them with a reprimand, but still remained without money. And indeed, he had every reason to be alarmed at his position, seeing that the Liberal League, headed by the middle classes, comprising a large part of the lower nobility and all the different sections of the lower orders, that this Liberal League was determined to have what it wanted. In vain the king had declared, in the opening speech, that he would never, never grant a constitution in the modern sense of the word. The Liberal League insisted upon such a modern, anti-feudal, representative constitution with all its sequels, liberty of the press, trial by jury, etc., and before they got it, not a farthing of money would they grant. There was one thing evident, that things could not go on long in this manner, and either one of the parties must give way, or that a rupture, a bloody struggle, must ensue. And the middle classes knew that they were on the eve of a revolution, and they prepared themselves for it. They sought to obtain by every possible means the support of the working class of the towns and of the peasantry in the agricultural districts, and it is well known that there was, in the latter end of 1847, hardly a single prominent political character among the bourgeoisie who did not proclaim himself a socialist in order to ensure to himself the sympathy of the proletarian class. We shall see these socialists at work by and by. This eagerness of the leading bourgeoisie to adopt, at least the outward show of socialism, was caused by a great change that had come over the working classes of Germany. There had been ever since 1840 a fraction of German workmen who, traveling in France and Switzerland, had more or less imbibed the crude socialist or communist notions then current among the French workmen. The increasing attention paid to similar ideas in France ever since 1840 made socialism and communism fashionable in Germany also, and as far back as 1843, all newspapers teemed with discussions of social questions. A school of socialists very soon formed itself in Germany, distinguished more for the obscurity than for the novelty of its ideas. Its principal efforts consisted in the translations of French Fourierist, Saint-Simonian, and other doctrines into the abstruse language of German philosophy. The German Communist school, entirely different from this sect, was formed about the same time. In 1844, there occurred the Silesian Weavers' riots, followed by the insurrection of the calico printers of Prague. These riots, cruelly suppressed, riots of workingmen not against the government but against their employers, created a deep sensation and gave a new stimulus to socialist and communist propaganda amongst the working people. So did the bread riots during the year of famine, 1847. In short, in the same manner as constitutional opposition rallied around its banner the great bulk of the propertied classes, with the exception of the large feudal landholders, so the working classes of the larger towns looked for their emancipation to the socialist and communist doctrines, although, under the then existing press laws, they could be made to know only very little about them. They could not be expected to have any very definite ideas as to what they wanted. They only knew that the program of the constitutional bourgeoisie did not contain all they wanted, and that their wants were nowise contained in the constitutional circle of ideas. There was then no separate Republican Party in Germany. People were either constitutional monarchists or more or less clearly defined socialists or communists. With such elements, the slightest collision must have brought about a great revolution. While the higher nobility and the older civil and military officers were the only safe supports of the existing system, while the lower nobility, the trading middle classes, the universities, the schoolmasters of every degree, and even part of the lower ranks of the bureaucracy and military officers were all leagued against the government. While behind these there stood the dissatisfied masses of the peasantry and of the proletarians of the large towns, supporting for the time being the liberal opposition, but already muttering strange words about taking things into their own hands, while the bourgeoisie was ready to hurl down the government, and the proletarians were preparing to hurl down the bourgeoisie in its turn. This government went on obstinately in a course which must bring about a collision. Germany was, in the beginning of 1848, on the eve of a revolution, and this revolution was sure to come, even had the French Revolution of February not hastened it. What the effects of this Parisian Revolution were upon Germany, we shall see in our next. London, September 1851.